They didn't take his life. He gave it away, on purpose. And the strangest part? He had multiple chances to escape and refused every single one. That night, in a city packed with hundreds of thousands of people, a man walked straight into a trap he could already see coming. The betrayal, the arrest, the torture, the cross, none of it was a surprise. He knew who would betray him. He knew when it would happen. He even knew how it would feel. And still, he didn't run. In fact, what he did next is so unexpected it almost doesn't make sense. Just hours before his arrest, instead of hiding, instead of fighting, instead of escaping, he sat down to eat with the man who was about to destroy him. Why?
The story begins in Jerusalem. Imagine a city vibrating with an almost electric tension. It was Passover, the most sacred festival of the Jewish people. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims were packed into the narrow, winding streets. The air was thick with the smell of roasting lamb, bitter herbs, and the dust of 1,000 journeys. But beneath the festive surface, a storm was brewing that no one was prepared for. Jesus, a man whose life was a series of impossible miracles and dangerous truths, was walking straight into a trap. For 3 years he had traveled the land, healing the blind with a touch and even raising the dead with a whisper. Crowds followed him everywhere. Some wanted a miracle, others wanted a political revolution. But Jesus was looking for something else entirely, something far deeper than a temporary throne. His message had enemies, powerful ones. The religious elite were terrified of his influence and even more afraid of the Roman response to his popularity. They were desperate to silence him, but there was one major problem. They couldn't touch him as long as the crowds were there. They needed a traitor. They needed a moment of darkness, and they were about to get both. The betrayal came from within. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 who had walked with Jesus for years, struck a deal for 30 pieces of silver. Those 30 coins weren't just currency. They were the legal price of a common slave. Imagine the sound of that bag hitting the floor of the temple, the cold, sharp ring of silver against stone. For Judas, that sound was a victory in the moment, but it would soon become a deafening roar of guilt that no amount of money could ever silence. The plot was hatched, the price was paid, the clock was ticking. But before the betrayal, there was a secret. In an upper room, hidden away from the prying eyes of the temple guards, Jesus gathered his 12 closest friends for one last meal. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with a realization that the end was near. As they sat there, Jesus did something that left them speechless. He didn't take the seat of honor. Instead, he grabbed a towel and a basin of water and began to wash their feet, the job of the lowest house slave. It was a silent, powerful message. In his kingdom, the one who leads is the one who serves. He was showing them that true greatness isn't found in how many people serve you, but in how many people you are willing to serve. Then he took the bread and the wine. He told them something that must have sounded like a haunting riddle. "This is my body given for you. This is my blood poured out for you." He was announcing a new covenant, a new deal between God and humanity. But the disciples were still confused. They thought he was about to take a physical throne in Jerusalem. They had no idea he was actually preparing for a cold grave. And then the first loop of the night closed. Jesus looked at Judas and whispered, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Judas slipped out into the shadows, and as the door closed behind him, the Bible says, "And it was night." The real darkness had begun its work. But what was about to happen next in the garden, none of them were ready for. Leaving the city, they crossed the Kidron Valley and entered a place called Gethsemane. The name literally means oil press, and that's exactly what this garden became, a place where the soul of Jesus was pressed until it bled. Jesus moved into the deep shadows, away from the others. He fell to his knees, his face pressed into the cold, damp earth, and then something happened that medical science struggles to even describe. Under the weight of extreme psychological and spiritual agony, his sweat began to fall like great drops of blood. This is a rare condition known as hematidrosis, where capillary vessels actually burst under intense stress. He wasn't just afraid of physical pain. He was looking into the cup, the concentrated weight of every human sin, every act of cruelty, every lie, and every betrayal in history. He who was perfect was about to be covered in our imperfection. He whispered, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." For a moment, the tension was at its breaking point. It seemed like the mission might change. But then came the resolve that changed the destiny of the world. "Not my will, but yours be done."
He rose from the dirt, but the silence of the garden didn't last long. Suddenly, the darkness was pierced by the orange glow of torches and the clink of Roman armor. The temple guards were there, led that Judas. The traitor walked up and greeted Jesus with a kiss, a sign of deep affection used as a tool of execution. Chaos erupted. Peter, acting on instinct and fear, drew a sword and sliced off the ear of a servant named Malchus. He was ready to fight a war. But Jesus? He stopped the violence in its tracks. He reached out, touched the wound, and healed the man who had come to arrest him. He told Peter, "Put your sword away. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" In that moment, everyone realized the truth. Jesus wasn't being captured because he was weak. He was allowing it to happen because he was on a mission. The disciples panicked. Seeing that he wouldn't fight back, their courage broke. One by one, they vanished into the shadows of the olive trees, leaving Jesus completely alone in the hands of his enemies. He was marched through the night to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. This was a sham of a trial, illegal by their own laws, held in secret, and fueled by a desperate need to silence a man they couldn't control. False witnesses were paid to lie, but their stories were so inconsistent they couldn't even build a case. Through it all, Jesus was silent. His silence was deafening. It was a physical weight in the room. Finally, the high priest demanded, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus looked him in the eye and said 2 words that sealed his fate. "I am." They lost control. The religious leaders, men who claimed to represent God, began to spit on him. They blindfolded him and punched him in the face, mocking him to prophesy who hit him. But while this was happening inside, a different kind of trial was happening outside in the courtyard. Peter, the man who had swore he would die for Jesus just hours earlier, was shivering by a fire, trying to blend in. 3 separate times people recognized him. "You were with him," they said. And 3 times the fear of the noose broke Peter's resolve. He cursed and swore, "I do not know the man." As the 3rd denial left his lips, a rooster crowed. Jesus was being led across the courtyard at that exact moment. Their eyes met. It wasn't a look of anger from Jesus. It was a look of heartbreaking knowing. Peter ran into the night and wept bitterly. As the sun began to rise, the religious leaders realized they couldn't legally execute him. For that, they needed Rome. They dragged him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate was a hard, cynical man, but even he could tell this wasn't a typical criminal. He looked at this beaten, dignified man and asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied with a statement that should have haunted Pilate for the rest of his life. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight." Pilate tried to find a way out. He declared, "I find no fault in him." But the religious leaders had stirred the mob into a frenzy. Pilate offered a choice, a Passover tradition where one prisoner is released. He stood Jesus next to a violent murderer and insurrectionist named Barabbas. "Which one do you want?" he asked.
The crowd, manipulated by the elite, roared, "Give us Barabbas! Crucify Jesus!" It was the ultimate trade. The guilty man went free, and the innocent man was led away to be tortured. To appease the crowd, Pilate ordered Jesus to be scourged.
The Roman scourging was not a simple beating. It was a masterpiece of cruelty. The whip, or flagrum, was tipped with lead balls and jagged pieces of bone. With every strike, the hooks literally plowed the flesh from his back, exposing muscle, tendons, and sometimes bone. Most men died from the scourging alone. By the time they were done, Jesus would have been in hypovolemic shock, his body trembling under the sheer trauma. The soldiers weren't finished. They wanted to mock his kingship. They threw a faded purple robe over his open wounds. They twisted a crown of long, sharp thorns and forced it into his scalp. They put a reed in his hand as a mock scepter and bowed before him in derision, striking him again and again. And yet, the worst was still to come. The cross was placed on his shredded shoulders. It was a heavy, splintered beam of timber that crushed into his wounds. He began the long, agonizing walk through the streets of Jerusalem toward Golgotha, the place of the skull. He was so physically decimated that he collapsed under the weight. The soldiers seized a man named Simon from the crowd and forced him to carry the timber the rest of the way. When they reached the hill, the world held its breath. They laid him on the wood. Imagine the sound of the hammers. Imagine the iron nails, roughly 7 inches long, tearing through the nerves of his wrists and feet. They hoisted the cross upright, and it dropped into the socket with a bone-jarring thud. For 6 hours, Jesus hung between heaven and earth. In the Roman world, crucifixion was designed to be the most shameful, painful way to die. It was a slow death by suffocation. To take a breath, Jesus had to push up on the nails in his feet, scraping his raw back against the rough wood. But it's what he said while he was dying that tells us who he really was. He didn't scream for revenge. He didn't curse the people who nailed him there. Instead, he looked down at the soldiers who were gambling for his clothes and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Beside him, 2 criminals were being executed. One joined in the mockery, but the other looked at Jesus and saw a king. "Lord, remember me," he whispered. Jesus turned his head and gave him a promise that has echoed through the centuries. "Today you will be with me in paradise." Even while he was dying to save the world, he was focused on saving the one man next to him. As the hours passed, the physical toll became unbearable. Jesus saw his mother, Mary, standing at the foot of the cross. Even in his agony, he made sure she was cared for, telling his disciple John to look after her as his own mother. Then, at noon, something impossible happened. The sun simply stopped shining. For 3 hours, a supernatural darkness covered the entire land. It was as if creation itself was mourning the death of its creator. In that darkness, the spiritual weight reached its peak. Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This was the moment of the great exchange, Jesus experiencing the separation from God that we deserved so that we would never have to. Weakened by dehydration and blood loss, he whispered, "I thirst." They offered him sour wine on a sponge, fulfilling the ancient prophecies. Finally, knowing that the work was complete, that the price for every sin had been paid in full, and the debt of humanity was settled, he didn't give a cry of defeat. He gave a shout of victory. He cried out, "It is finished." He didn't lose his life. He gave it up. With his last breath, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He bowed his head and died. At that exact moment, the earth shook, rocks split open, and inside the temple, the massive, thick veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the world was torn in half from top to bottom. The message was clear. The barrier was gone. The way to God was finally open.
A Roman centurion, a man hardened by years of death and execution, watched all of this. He had seen hundreds of men die on crosses, but he had never seen a man die like this. He looked up at the silent figure of Jesus and whispered, "Surely this was the Son of God." But here is the thing you have to understand. This wasn't just a historical event. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a choice. Jesus chose the thorns. He chose the nails. He chose the darkness because he chose you. History records the crucifixion as an end. The religious leaders thought they had won. The disciples thought they had lost everything. But what they didn't realize was that the cross wasn't the final word. And in the next moment of this journey, everything you think you know about life and death is about to change. Death itself is about to be defeated. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of that sacrifice, don't stop here. You've seen the darkness, but you haven't seen the dawn. Join us for the next part of this journey as we witness the moment that changed everything forever. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell because the tomb is about to open and you don't want to miss what happens next. The sacrifice is finished. The victory is coming. We'll see you at the empty tomb.